Welcome. These are the notes, the first set of notes for Chapter 5, and it's an introduction to cell transport. It starts on page 97 in your book. In class, you're going to watch this video and answer these questions about what the organism is doing. So here's the video. I'm going to let it play. Alright, so that's the end of the video. I hope that you enjoyed that. Stop there. Alright, so what is this organism and what is it doing? This organism is an amoeba. That was the larger one that was engulfing the smaller one. The smaller one was a paramecium. Now, an amoeba is an animal-like protist that has to consume food. So that is, in fact, what it was doing. It was stretching its cell membrane and itself around the paramecium. And when the two arm-like structures meet, the cell membrane will fuse together and the paramecium will be trapped inside the amoeba. At which point the amoeba will send in some lysosomes and dump those digestive enzymes into that pocket or that bubble that the paramecium is floating in. And the paramecium will then be digested. The amoeba can then use those nutrients and those parts for itself. So thinking about the structure of the cell membrane. This is letter C. You know that the cell membrane is the fluid mosaic model. So those phospholipids that make up the cell membrane aren't exactly attached to each other. So just take a minute and think about how it might be possible for the amoeba to do that. It's pretty cool. The standards for this set of notes are to compare active and passive transport. And what we mean by transport is moving things from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. And this is an important survival mechanism. It allows us to maintain homeostasis. So that's what we're going to talk about in these notes. First of all, let's go back to homeostasis. We mentioned it some at the beginning of the year, and this is a definition that's a little bit different, but it means the same thing. So you have a relatively stable state, it's in there twice, a stable state of equilibrium or a tendency towards such a state. So we want to have a relatively stable level or an equilibrium, a stable level for our body temperature. We want to have a stable level or an equilibrium for our blood sugar levels. We don't want them to go too high or too low. It makes us feel sick when they do swing really high and really low. So we'd like an equilibrium, which is kind of like saying a steady level. A macro example, and macro meaning big, so on a large scale, our body temperature and our blood sugar levels are really good examples of homeostasis. Let's talk about on a cellular level, though, on a micro example. Cells have to maintain proper levels of water and nutrients, and it's vitally important that they do or they won't survive. If your cells don't survive, you don't survive. So maintaining equilibrium with the water and the nutrients that are inside and outside the cell is vitally important to our survival. And that's what we're going to talk about in this chapter. So there are two main types of cell transport. There's passive transport and active transport. This goes back to one of the standards that you have to be able to distinguish between active and passive transport. So here it is. Passive transport is when you move things across the cell membrane or into the cell or out of the cell that does not use any energy. And active, therefore, would be the movement of substances across the cell membrane that requires the use of energy. We're going to talk about exactly what this energy is in a few moments. So passive uses no energy, active uses energy. If you think about what you could do on a Saturday afternoon, you could do something passive that really doesn't require any energy, like laying around on the couch and watching TV. Or you could do something that requires energy, which would be to get outside and play a sport, or even have your friends over and have a really active, dynamic time playing video games. So either one, passive and active. Passive transport. This is the movement of molecules without using any energy, and there are three different types that we're going to talk about. So whenever you see these three words, diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis, they all mean passive transport. There is no energy required by the cell in order for these things to happen. So diffusion, this is movement of molecules, usually gases, like O2, which is the form that our oxygen is in, and carbon dioxide, in and out of the cell. So diffusion, it can be other things, but it's usually gases. And in our body systems, O2 and CO2 are the best examples of diffusion, because the oxygen from our blood diffuses into the cells that need the oxygen. Carbon dioxide is a waste product that we breathe out. So in order for the carbon dioxide, it has to get into your bloodstream to be carried back to your lungs. It needs to diffuse through the cell membrane and into the blood vessels, where it can be carried back to your lungs and then expelled. Facilitated diffusion is for molecules that are solids, that are a little bit bigger, that are not those dissolved gases. So things like salt and sugar. Now we all know that the body needs sugar or glucose in order to make energy, or ATP, in the mitochondria. These molecules have to be moved through the cell membrane by a transport protein. They can't just wiggle their way between the phospholipids and slip in and out like the gases can. They're a little bit too large. So you have to have a transport protein that acts like a straw, so the sugar can slide right through the straw, which spans the cell membrane. Osmosis is very, very similar to diffusion, except we're not talking about molecules like gases. We're specifically talking about water. And believe it or not, water actually does push its way through the phospholipids. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the cell membrane in the next set of notes. So, there are 3 types of passive transport. Diffusion, which is the movement of small molecules like gases, such as oxygen and carbon dioxide. Facilitated diffusion is movement of molecules that's a little bit larger that require transport protein. Okay, so they need a little bit of help. That's where the facilitated part comes in. And then osmosis is exactly the same as diffusion, except we're dealing specifically with water molecules. Active transport. There are 3 types of active transport that we will talk about as well. The first one is protein pumps. Much like facilitated diffusion that use transport proteins, these are transport proteins as well, except they require the use of ATP molecules or energy. Endocytosis. This is when the membrane reshapes itself to engulf large particles or other cells. This is what you saw in the very beginning, when the amoeba was able to push its cell membrane out and around the paramecium to engulf it. That's called endocytosis. Cytosis meaning cytoplasm, endo meaning into the cytoplasm. Exocytosis is exactly the opposite. Exo meaning to exit, cytosis meaning cytoplasm. So to exit the cytoplasm or to leave the cell. And this is when the membrane reshapes itself to expel large particles or vesicles. Now we went through that pretty quickly. There are 3 types of passive transport and 3 types of active transport. This is an overview of the chapter, so we're going to talk about each of these in much more detail as the chapter goes on. This is just the overview. So this is all we're going to do with endocytosis and exocytosis. So here's a video clip. These are your only notes on endocytosis and exocytosis, so keep that in mind.
Cells can move large particles across the membrane by bulk transport. Bulk transport into the cell is called endocytosis. Bulk transport out of the cell is called exocytosis. During endocytosis, the cell membrane folds into a pouch surrounding particles outside the cell. A vesicle is formed. This vesicle carries the particles into the cell and can release its contents into the cytoplasm. Human white blood cells engulf bacteria and other unwanted cells. This process is called phagocytosis. Phagocytosis is another example of endocytosis. Once inside the cell, the vesicle containing the bacteria fuses with another vesicle called a lysosome. The lysosome contains digestive juices which destroy the bacteria. Exocytosis is the opposite of endocytosis. Particles are transported out of the cell. A vesicle containing wastes or cell products moves toward the cell membrane. The membrane surrounding the vesicle fuses with the cell membrane. The contents of the vesicle are secreted as the membrane smooths out.
All right, so as you can see, endocytosis and exocytosis is the reshaping of the cell membrane to engulf or expel large particles. Both of these require energy, so they fall under active transport. So let's talk about that energy that's required for active transport. We've talked a little bit about it in the past. Energy for the cell is made where? Yep, the mitochondria. This process that happens in the mitochondria is called cell respiration. And I know you guys are excited because we have a whole chapter on cell respiration. It's actually after this one. So cell respiration happens in the mitochondria, and here's a picture of the mitochondria. And cell respiration takes glucose right here, which is a simple sugar, and the carbohydrate monomer. So glucose goes into the mitochondria, cell respiration happens, and out comes ATP, also known as adenosine triphosphate. Now, I'm not going to make you come up with the word adenosine triphosphate, but if you see it, you need to know that it stands for ATP. So here's the A, adenosine, T for tri, and then P for phosphate, adenosine triphosphate. This is what adenosine triphosphate is often drawn as. This is the adenosine molecule. Here is a 5-sided sugar. And here are the 3 phosphates. So this is the energy molecule ATP. So adenosine triphosphate, and they're held together with a sugar molecule. Here's a short video clip on ATP and how it's made.
Welcome to BioVid Episode 3. My name is Leslie Samuel. In this video I'm going to be talking about ATP, what it is, and how it works. Now take a look at this guy. He's preparing for a big match, he's been training, he's been exercising, and doing everything that he needs to do to get ready for that big day. But the question is, how does he get this energy? Well, part of the answer has to do with a small molecule with a big name, and that molecule is adenosine triphosphate, or you can call it ATP for short. Here you can see the A representing adenosine, and you can see 3 P's representing 3 phosphate groups. ATP is a molecule in the cell that allows for quick and easy access to energy when needed by the cell's organelles. In other words, this is the energy currency of the body. When the cell needs energy, it gets it from ATP. It's a type of chemical energy in that it releases energy when the chemical bonds are broken. When the bond is broken between 2 phosphate groups, that releases energy. Let's take a look at how exactly this happens in the cell. Here we have a process, and as you can see, it's in desperate need of some energy. Fortunately, there's ATP that comes along, and when that ATP comes to the process, it breaks the bond between 2 phosphate groups and donates 1 phosphate to that process or that protein or whatever it is that needs that energy. When this happens, the process gets the energy that it needs, and it can then do whatever task it needs to accomplish. Let's get rid of this process for now, and now you can see we are left with 2 phosphate groups, so it's no longer ATP, it's ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. If we want to use this molecule again, we need to recharge it as we would do for a rechargeable battery. In order to do this in the cell, we need a very special organelle called the mitochondria. ADP then goes to the mitochondria, and the ADP gets recharged by the mitochondria adding another phosphate on, and it's now ATP again. So whatever you're doing, whether you're preparing for a big match or just going for a jog, playing some football, or even just spending time with your special someone in the park, it does take energy, and that energy is provided by ATP.
Alright, you do need to know the basics of ATP. You also need to know what ADP is. So if you need to watch that video again, it is a standalone video in the playlist for Chapter 5. So if you just want to review that later, you can. Alright, so a quick review. Homeostasis, that steady equilibrium, 2 types of cell membrane transport, and give examples, the passive and active. And then the energy molecule that we talked about was ATP, made from glucose in the mitochondria, and it's used during active transport. That's it for the notes. Have a great evening.